Welcome to the New Monastics podcast, where we'll be discussing all aspects of the contemplative life and interspirituality in the context of modernity. On each episode, we will choose a topic to explore with one of today's leading teachers or thinkers. The New Monastics podcast is a project of Charis Foundation for New Monasticism and Interspirituality, which is dedicated to the emergence of a newly conceived contemplative life of embodied spirituality and sacred activism. Welcome to the New Monastics podcast. I'm Nathaniel Miles Yepes, your host and dialogue partner for our guests.
And I'm Daniel, your other host and interviewer.
Today we have my friend and colleague, Chris Maddox, the founder of the Wild Woman Project, teaching women how to access their Wild Woman Archetype, and the Wild Woman Fest, a women's festival and retreat fostering a deep connection to nature.
Welcome to the show, Chris. We're happy to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be with y'all.
Well, this is great. Chris, we haven't talked in a long time, and this is just a fantastic opportunity for us to reconnect. And maybe we'll start with how we know each other, just as a setup to say, I don't know everything that there is to know. We know each other more personally, and so it goes back probably to a connection to Sufism. And I think we've probably first met at the Abode of the Message in New Lebanon, New York, which was a Sufi retreat center. And that's where I learned about your work and you hosting the Wild Woman Fest on the mountain there. And then you became connected to the dialogues that my foundation hosts, which are now called the Charis Snowmass Dialogues, where we dialogue around issues of interspirituality and the spiritual path and how the different ways in which we approach it. And so really I know most about you from your personal story and the way you approach your own spirituality, and less about the Wild Woman Project. So, maybe you can say a little bit about, what that is to you and how that came about. And then we can get into our spiritual paths again a little more deeply.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just want to say that our interspiritual dialogue space is one of my favorite spaces on earth. I love doing that work, and I've enjoyed all the time I've spent with the Charis folks. So yes, in terms of the Wild Woman Project, it's interesting because when I'm talking to men, you can't come into my space and experience what it is, So it's like this mystery. But I will say the way the Wild Woman Project came into being was kind of earlier in my spiritual path, in my early 20s. I was living in New York City. And through a process of being like a theater person, I happened into this movement class that the teacher was guiding us through this chakra system. And up until that point, I was like a very devout atheist. Since I was 12 years old, just like very sure, And she was guiding this meditation up the chakra system. And that kind of sort of cracked that all wide open for me. And I realized that there was a lot more going on inside, outside. And it started me on this whole path of just seeking. So I was living in New York City and I absorbed anything I could get my hands on. So I would go to yoga classes. I'd end up in these weird gong bath situations. I'd be wandering through crystal shops and, just talking. There was a moment where I had a mentor who I met on the street who was a wizard. He had long hair and he carried a wand in his pocket. So I had all sorts of very strange, sort of whimsical, wandering experiences as a young person, and there was this, I think, I was a theater person. I found that when I was an adolescent, thank goodness, that was anchoring for me. And actually, I think that my life as a theater person in my adolescence was my introduction to ritual. That's one of the oldest rituals that there is. And by being an actor that asks you, when you're studying a character, to try to get inside the world of that character. So I had all of this sort of natural contemplative stuff happening. It was like part of my development, but it was really in the arts. And then there I found myself spiritual seeking. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I found the V-Day movement. So that's Eve Ensler, who wrote the Vagina Monologues. And she has like V-Day, and it's this global movement. I don't know if this is still the language they use, but to end violence against women. So there was this place where it was theater, there was movement and dance and ritual. And then there was this activism, and it was the first time that I had been in like an all female space. And there's something really special that happens in that kind of a space. So, I was part of the V-Day movement, and it wasn't long after that, for many years actually, it wasn't long after that I started facilitating a women's circle at my local yoga studio, where I was also a teacher at that point, which I was a yoga teacher for 7 years. And this women's circle, like the woman who owned the studio just basically asked me to take over this group that she had been doing for many years, but I had never experienced the group. She basically told me you can do whatever you want in this circle. So I started by doing what I knew how to do, which was like lead meditations. Then we'd have questions, like a contemplative question. Then we'd make intentions, and then it started to get a little bit more ritual-y. And that circle went on for 3 years, and it was such a special experience. Like, I know many of the women to this day that were in that circle, and it meant so much to us. So during the course of all this happening, I was recommended about 5 or 7 different times to read the book, Women Who Run with the Wolves, The Myths and Stories of the Wild Woman Archetype, by Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And that was one of those big moments in life. I remember being at the Borders bookstore, rest in peace, Borders, on Columbus Circle, and reaching for this book, Nathaniel, and like having this experience where I almost felt like there was electricity coming out of it. It was so odd.
Yeah, I know
and
that experience.
I open, and I'm reading the first page of the first chapter, and my whole body is just like vibrating. And what she did with that book was, I think, essentially, because it's the first time the wild woman archetype is used. And she's basically pointing to all these old stories where the expression of this particular archetype is alive and well. And you see all these different parts of the archetype. But she's telling it from old stories, but she's using the language for the first time, the wild woman archetype. That archetype was like what I had been waiting for in terms of all the seeking. Once I found that, it's like I didn't need anything else. It was a big enough umbrella that it could hold all of the spiritual urges and inclinations that like I connected with and had found unto that point. And that, I think, that moment was in early 2011. I ended up launching the Wild Woman Project on January 1st, 2012. And my main focus was that I was just going to teach women how to lead these circles like I had been leading that were so powerful. And that was what I was going to focus on doing. I had this vision of seeing like these circles all over the world. And the wild woman archetype was part of it, but that's really something that's been cultivated over the last 11 years. Like how and what, and how is that an anchor for it? But the circles themselves felt like an expression of that archetype. So that was the beginning. And, now we have like circles in 24 countries and 43 out of the 50 United States. We have Wild Woman Project circles happening. And, there's a lot more people engaged in what we're doing at this point. Yeah. I mean, that's the beginnings.
So what happened with the Wild Woman Fest, and how did that develop? And What,
Yeah.
how did it become that anchor?
Yeah. Well, I had moved from New York City because it was this point, in terms of like the spiritual journey of that, where being around so many people in that concrete environment became like increasingly nothing. My system couldn't handle it at a certain point. I was like, I can't even hear my own thoughts anymore. Like so my first move was to move to the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts. And that's 30 minutes from the abode of the message. So I happened into in that area, and that area in the Berkshires is so rich with so much spiritual depth. There's like a lot of history there from so many different traditions. Almost everyone I met was like some form of a mystic kind of person, from some tradition. And I didn't know anyone. So I wandered into this. It was like a full moon chanting women's circle. I was like, yes, please sign me up. And the woman who sat down next to me, like, we looked at each other and immediately connected. And then we were assigned to like give each other these healing blessings. It was like a very intimate first meeting. But that person is Amanda Salima McCall, who was a Sufi and was a graduate of the Saluk program in the Nayati order. And I wandered with her to one of the meditations, or the zikrs, actually. That was my first introduction, and I came to the abode, And I saw, I started coming to the abode a lot, and I studied Sufism for like 6 years, I think. But there were events that were happening up on top of that mountain. And I thought, what would it be like if we could take all the components of what goes on in a women's circle, but like stretch it out over a few days? And I thought of it that way. I was like, let's have a retreat. Let's have an event. And, the first year, I think there were like 50 of us total. And then sort of grew and grew. And by the third year, the festival had like sold out in a few days. So there was a hunger for whatever that was, the ritual. What we ended up doing was, dancing around the fire and meditating together and, doing all the things. I mean, I've been to all kinds of retreats. I mean, we're doing very similar sorts of things, but it's different. And I think what makes it distinct is the attention to ritual, like big, big ritual. Like a lot of the facilitators have backgrounds in like theater, so they're bringing in all of these different kind of theatrical components, and just being in nature too. A lot of retreats happen in retreat centers that are, air conditioned and with nice beds, being out kind of in that rustic feel, being that close, being like scared at night. What is that sound outside? That kind of like wakes you up to it's like a different space.
Yeah, it makes me curious, just in the circles and in the festival, kind of what role the wild woman archetype plays, and how do you speak to that, to the women who are gathered, and kind of what guiding role does it play in terms of the activities or the teaching that's happening?
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, there's an understanding that it is an interspiritual space, and it's also an intergenerational space. Like, we're coming from all different backgrounds in terms of culture, belief systems, etc. But where we are focused and what we agree upon is nature is teacher, is guide, is friend. And that's one of the biggest pieces of the wild woman archetype, as I understand it, is just like the visceral, just really intimate connection to the natural world. And, that's explored in various different ways. Each circle, the facilitator will usually focus on an element or a symbol in nature is pretty common. So that we're sort of gathering around this intention to connect more deeply to the natural world and to see what's there. And in my experience, every little bit of nature, from every tree to every little cloud that passes in the sky, or the shift of light in a moment, like they're all portals into a pretty rich spiritual connection, and sometimes like symbolic teaching, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So those are a few of the ways, Everyone's really encouraged to follow their inner guidance in kind of a radical way, when we're all together, which is not something that we can all necessarily do every moment of our mundane lives. But since we're all just like up there, up for an adventure, one of the things that we put right at the fore is use these days while we're here and just promise yourself to trust yourself. Like, if wherever you feel guided to go do that, And that freedom is a really big piece of the Wild Woman archetype, Think of the Wild Woman archetype. She's like usually this kind of character that's existing outside of the civilization or outside of the village, and like has cultivated and created her own little universe that she gets to exist in. And having as modern human beings, like for most people, that's not attainable. And like for me, that's not even like desirable necessarily. It's more just symbolic, But that you can create, I think one of the biggest pieces or lessons that you can get from an experience like that, where you're allowing yourself to follow your inner guidance in such a radical way that it becomes more second nature when you are out in your life. And there is a lot of wiggle room in terms of where you can follow your inner guidance, depending upon how your life's set up.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. That's clarifying for me in the sense of wild, not indicating any inherent practice or action, but more wild in the sense of free to follow and do whatever is coming through in terms of the guidance, so that different aspects of being wild can manifest through different people in radically different ways, and it doesn't necessarily look a certain way.
1000%. Couldn't have said it better myself. Yeah.
I had a funny moment a few years ago. I was in it's kind of a Fight Club moment, if you've ever seen the movie Fight Club. And I was in a diner somewhere, and kind of late, somewhere you could go late at night and continue a conversation. And I was in a diner somewhere with my foundation partner, Rory, that you know. And Rory and I are talking, and we're talking about, our next dialogue. And we're really like to have Chris back, because, you're really a great partner in our dialogues and a great participant. And so we were saying this, and I don't know, we might have mentioned, Wild Woman. And a minute later, like the waitress that had been waiting on us, and I don't remember where this was, she says, "Do you mean Chris Maddox and Wild Woman Fest?" And he said, yeah, Chris is our friend. And she says, "I was at the first one. I've been every year." And, when I say Fight Club moment, it's like this woman, maybe a few children, and she's working a late shift at a diner. This is the most impactful thing in her life. This is the thing that she orients to make the rest of her life make sense. And she's working at a diner, and she might be working, at some other department store, or she might be in business. But that's the impact of this kind of circle. And it was great. And we just thought it was so funny,
I love that.
And, she wanted to talk to us for like 10 minutes, it was
amazing.
Because it meant so much to her.
Oh, that's so nice to hear.
So Fight Club.
Fight Club.
I was going to say, I think the women seem to have something a lot more productive and healthy and nourishing going on than the men with their Fight Club.
And also, first rule of Fight Clubs, you don't talk about it, but there are these secret cell members out there. It was really great. I just totally unrelated to our conversation, I happened to I had a copy of Women Who Run with Wolves in my hand, and I've never read it. I remember Clarissa Pinkola Estes calling my teacher when I was sitting with him once. I think she lives in Denver, or did live in
Yeah.
Denver. But I'd never gotten around to reading her book. And I had the copy in my hand the other day, and I just opened it, unrelated to talking to you, and open to a perfect spot for me. Now, the archetype of the wolf is very important to me personally. And I opened right to La Loba, the wolf woman.
Mm-hmm.
And if I remember right, there are all these various descriptions of what, the wolf woman's stories have been. And she's a collector of bones. And with those bones, she makes something. How do you understand that wolf woman archetype and what she's doing? This must have come up,
Yeah.
for you in these circles.
Yeah.
She's definitely wild in another sense.
Oh, yeah, La Loba. Well, that first passage I was telling you about when I was reading the book for the first time, and I felt all that energy. She starts the book by making the comparison that healthy women and healthy wolves have a lot in common. They're very loyal. They have great care of their pack. They're playful. They're vital. And she also says that the world treats wolves and women similarly.
Mm-hmm.
Suspicious of them, scared of them. Sort of the way that modern civilization is cutting back the wilds and getting rid of the wolves' habitats.
Mm-hmm.
And so then the wolves are becoming hungry, and it's harder and harder for them to stay healthy. And that causes all these issues. And she's making this comparison that this is what's going on also with the feminine psyche, is that the modern world is sort of like cutting back the wilds in the culture and what's allowed. And a woman who is free like that and instinctual and vital, and the world is suspicious of and tries to sort of muddle down or bring down. And largely she talks about it being misunderstood, like they're both misunderstood. And that book's was it published in 1989 or early 90s? So a lot has changed in the culture since then, of course, but I think some of that stuff just really remains very, very true. I mean, it's a long timeline. But, she's essentially in that book really piecing together, like looking for hints, like she talks about like finding psychic archaeological evidence of something, some way of being that has been lost.
Mm.
And that really resonated with me in the beginning, and it continues to, because I would love to study like ancient feminine, like spiritual practice, but it doesn't really exist. You get like bits and pieces, but that's been stomped out. And I think she's trying, and we are trying, like whenever we say often that we're remembering and reimagining what it means to be a woman untamed. So there's some part that we're trying to remember, like, was there another way? And if so, what was it? And then what's possible in the future? How can we reimagine this? How can we work with this, the lost history?
Mm-hmm. Speaking of that, part of what grabbed me when I opened that passage is loba. It's in Spanish. We both have Mexican American heritage. You and growing up in Texas,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in some indigenous heritage around indigenous peoples. For me in Mexico, you there in Texas. There's even a great song called La Loba by La Chica. A really fantastic song. But what comes up to me around that is that kind of visceral being caught by that heritage, being caught by ancestral lineage. And I wonder how that connects for you. That is this connected for you specifically to a kind of maternal inheritance through ancestors? And, how vital is that in your life?
Yeah, in my mother's bloodline, Mexican and South Texas, formerly Mexico, there are a lot of healers. There's a lot of like old stories from my family on that side that have always stirred me spiritually in the way that like my paternal side has not, even though they're both very much a part of me in different ways. But I think one of the reasons that I resonate with that book so much is Dr. Estes is also Mexican. And I believe she's adopted into a family that has like a European, where she gets a lot of the old European folklore. Like she was adopted into a family like that. So she has this mixture that's similar to my own mixture that I think causes this beautiful kind of resonance with that work. But yeah, I mean, some of my earliest special spiritual experiences were with my grandmother giving me limpias and not really understanding what that was, but understanding that it was really cool. I felt something, So I think, that's a big piece of it for me personally.
Nice.
And I want to just zero in on something I was really struck by, and just kind of looking at the website and stuff, is it seemed like in terms of the work of the Wild Woman Project, that there seems to be, in a way, two interconnected trajectories, and one being personal and one collective, and that you speak to a kind of personal liberation and healing for individual women to kind of partake in. But then you also speak to the way in which liberated, empowered women can help heal humanity and help kind of lead humanity in different ways. You say women have specific superpowers that the world needs. And so aside from being very curious about being let in, if I may, on what those specific superpowers are, I mean, I know some of them, but I feel like y'all are probably hiding some of them wisely so, But just jokes aside, I'm really curious about that interconnection between the personal healing and then the collective just situation. Like here we are all together, and there's so many issues, and it came through really clearly to me that, it wasn't just personal, that there is this, and also just to this kind of point of that it's also not just for women, even if it's particularly oriented towards women. That was the sense that I got, was that it was like women need to do their work so that they can be the best version of themselves. And that's the best thing for the planet, for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. I think a lot of the superpowers, the quote unquote superpowers, have a lot to do with intuition and instinct. And especially as that pertains to relations, like I think, I look at so many different families around me, different cultures, different backgrounds. And by and large, the women are like the glue in a lot of ways. They're like, keeping everyone together. They have a sense of what's going on in their pack, But the witch wound is basically that, the last few thousand years have not been great for womankind, especially when she's like expressing her ability to be in a healing space, to have any connection to spirit or the divine, or whatever language you want to use, that isn't channeled through some form of a gatekeeper, such as a
Right.
priest, a preacher, etc. That I think those of us who find nature to be our primary spiritual teacher, we don't really need that middle person or middle people. We actually, that's a little cumbersome, actually. There's a lot that happens there that gets in the way. So much to say there, but there's a lot of patterns in history of abusive dynamics, that those seats have oftentimes been held by people who abuse their power in different ways. So the witch wound is kind of like this shame that we carry that coincides with a very real fear of survival.
Mm-hmm.
Like on some level, on some kind of cellular, ancient memory level, for a woman to have a spiritual experience where her guidance comes through and she gets some form of a message. There's an almost fear, depending upon the woman and the culture in which she lives, to share that or to act upon it. There can even be a sense of shame. I mean, if you look at the Genesis story, what is Eve's major crime there? She wants to eat a fruit from the tree of knowledge. And this woman is literally made the villain of the story. And what was her crime? Like, it doesn't make so in that suspicion and looking at a woman who is curious and sure of herself and reaching for the fruit from the tree of knowledge as like some kind of a major problem, for which women have been very punished for that kind of activity. So when we think about like your question on the level of society, there's a lot to break down. Like, why don't women trust themselves? Why is intuition hard to access? Why don't they act on that guidance that comes through? I mean, there's a lot of conditioning that has come down the pike culturally, whether you're immersed in Christianity or not, where the messaging has really been like, you can't trust yourself,
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You can't trust yourself. And to me, it's just like that, like pains me to say that out loud. But I know from my own personal experience and from sitting in circle with women a lot and hearing their stories, there's a lot of, I can't trust myself. I can't be trusted with my own self. And when you can't trust yourself, then you're reaching for institutions or other people to try to like tell you how to be. And then your life ends up being a thing that you didn't make, but sort of a result of conditions. And what I would like to see is women reclaiming their trust in themselves. Sounds so simple, but like it's really, really important. And for some reason, for many reasons, it needs to be fortified. It needs to be built back up. So I continuously get the question, like, why can't men come? Why is it just women? I'm just like, because there's a huge backstory here, There's a huge backstory here, and we need space for ourselves to do the work that's unique to our condition and to our inheritance. Men have their own inheritance and their own different kind of work to do. And I definitely believe that, I got this actually from our friend Brenda, that we need together spaces and we need separate spaces.
Yeah.
If you're enjoying the episode, please consider subscribing to our Patreon to help support the production of the podcast.
Subscriptions begin at $1. All patrons receive access to bonus content, curated resources, and exclusive patron events, including live Q&As.
For more information, please check out the Patreon link in the show notes, and thanks for listening. I think the one thing I'm left with more curiosity around is just this question of really just dreaming and envisioning, like, what is the impact upon the world? Like, if you unleash a legion of wild healer women upon the world, like, what is the positive impact of that you could see? Like, that kind of dreaming element of, like, if we accept that there's the personal stuff has to happen first, like we have to kind of like help ourselves to then be in a position to have something to like offer that's actually going to be beneficial.
Yeah.
But I'm just kind of curious how you see that. I was thinking in this vein, Hazarnayat Khan, who's you're familiar with, has this quote. He says, "I see as clear as daylight that the hour is coming when women will lead humanity to a higher evolution." And he said that about 100 years ago. And so that vision of like, I'm curious, like I want to be led to a higher evolution. Like, we've been messing I'm curious how you see that,
Yeah, it's a fascinating time. I feel so blessed to be alive at this particular moment because of the potentialities and just so many of us are so free, so much more free than our grandmothers could ever imagine.
Mm-hmm.
So when I imagine in that exercise, like, what does that look like? I think a lot about what I hear from the family members of the women that participate with the Wild Woman Project.
Mm-hmm.
For instance, I talked to the fiance or about to be husband of one of my wild women. And it was not long after our latest retreat last August. And he was like, "I still don't really understand what you're doing there. But what I can say is when she came home, she was on clouds. Like she was lit and happy. She was like the most relaxed I had seen her in the longest time. Like I think relaxed women, like women haven't had the luxury to be relaxed. And a relaxed woman who has had the space and time to like tend to the inner self, not so concerned with taking care of everybody else, which has historically been the duty. She's freed up to be kind. She's freed up to be creative. And I think we probably I'm not like in the habit, and it's kind of like a fun exercise. Maybe I'll think about it more now that you've asked this, Daniel, like what would that look like? It seems like a long road because what the situation is now is that we're inheriting a society, the economic systems, the political systems, etc., that are not made by women and not made with the voices of women by and large.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting for women to try to step into those structures because you're not going to get like, if this was a blank canvas, what a woman would create for the society. What you're getting is like women stepping in to this, and they're not exactly free to do what they wish to do or how that they would do it if they had full creative freedom. Right. I think it's going to be a while. I think we're going to actually in our lifestyle, and we are seeing this already, we're going to see kind of a lot of destruction first, a lot of dismantling of a lot of systems, which is going to look like a lot of chaos that has to do with the woman thing and a lot more. That's a big, broad inheritance. But, I think women who trust themselves make better partners, they make better mothers, they make better teachers, they make better community members, make better neighbors, wherever they stand, they trust themselves in that moment. I just think we'll just see something a little different,
Stay tuned.
Exactly. Like we'll be old, like we won't even see it in our lifetime, but it's a fun process to watch it sort of unfurl.
It reminds me of, some of the discussion around this is like comes up around discussions of not only patriarchy, but whiteness. And you'll see some of the same patterns there. Like when, at my university, if students of color want an affinity space for students of color, there might be a white student who says, why can't I be in that? And just like you'll get men that'll say, why can't I be in that? And I think it's the same pattern because those two privileged groups have not experienced exclusion. And then they're trying to not be excluded, but the purpose was never not to exclude them. It wasn't to exclude them. There's a certain kind of nutrient to not having to hold up a certain kind of projected identity in front of us, to drop all those identities, to be comfortable with each other. And that's for men and women. And that's what Brenda is saying,
Mm-hmm.
that we're actually not giving ourselves this nutrient of having a bath, in this sort of marinade.
Yeah.
And not having to play roles, because we do have to play roles. It's a fact of the diversity of our existence. We have to code switch and know how to talk to different people. And to not have to do that sometimes is healing.
Yeah.
So, what I'm coming back to here is that your spaces are inherently interspiritual spaces, and this is really the subject of our podcast in general, but in two different ways. One way is obvious. Because it's women, then whether they're Jewish women or Christian women or not aligned with any tradition does not matter. The unifying element is being a woman and understanding that and creating deep relationship to that spiritually. And I think that that's the second inherent interspirituality. That interspirituality can be just purely between. It's not in any tradition. It's spirituality, at the center of my complex identity in a complex world with complex influences. And I stand at the center of it and I explore. So I want to throw this curveball in. I've already brought in Fight Club. I might as well bring in more pop references. So when you were talking about the electric moment of touching that book, Women That, Who Run with the Wolves, and, I related to that experience. Maybe not to that intense degree, but you're naming how you experienced it, and that's a distinctly spiritual moment of recognition. And what's spiritual about it is this strangeness of the compellingness that you experience there. Like something has me. I don't know what to call it, but it has me and it's real. And maybe I can't prove it to you that I had such an experience, but I can't deny it to myself. And this seems to be at the heart of your own spiritual path, the learning how to pay attention to your own experience and honor it and value its voice, which made me think of J.R.R. Tolkien. And J.R.R. Tolkien...
Here we go, buckle up.
Exactly. So Tolkien had this idea, and he lived it. He used to talk about mythopoeia, or mythopoesis, which is kind of a term that he coined, which meant that we really extend God's creative activity. The divine activity, we are agents of it because we're the fruit of the planet. We continue to grow outward into the universe, and everything that we do is an extension of this divine play and creative expression. But that's what's usually talked about with him. And so he felt like that's what his Lord of the Rings was, too, and his Silmarillion. But there was another deeper dimension to that, which was he believed what he was doing was true. It wasn't fiction. It was true. And I think what he was trying to say is, you catch a note in your inner ear, you catch a vibe that is so compelling that it stirs your whole being, and to respond to it is to respond to a truth that divinity wants to express through you. And so he's not playing at writing a creative fiction that lots of people will like and read and become a bestseller. He was following the note. He felt that that was a true place, whether it ever happened or not. It was true. And I think that this is a really deep thing, whether you're an artist or a spiritual practitioner. When you catch hold of that, you can feel when you're on or off in its exploration. And the more you're on, the more a true thing is given birth to in the world. And I think this is something of the nature of what the Wild Woman Project is for you, what your personal spiritual project is. So how do you approach your own process around those things?
First of all, I just
I know, I just threw
love
that whole
that.
thing.
I love that. My whole body is resonating with that note. Yeah, I mean, my major sense of spirituality is just, and it's just this, or my approach to life, which is just another way to say that, is that it's this ongoing creative process. And that's what really, to me, like my most treasured practice that I do every day is I wake up and I sit on my couch with my journal and a cup of coffee and my pup these days. And usually some form of poetry, like Mary Oliver. I'm reading the Tao Te Ching right now, just like little something to stir me a little bit. And then I sit and I do a combination of a little bit of reading, a little bit of meditating, and mostly just like sitting there waiting for the magic to happen, which is like the creative stream to start to flow through. And, I have a bookshelf full of journals. I'm just taking notes on what comes through, and I just happen to I set up my life so I could just pour my creative energy into this Wild Woman project. But I probably could have poured it in a lot of different places. It's just where I think anyone probably can. But I poured it there, and I continue to. And I really look at everything that I make, in terms of the spiritual spaces, like more like art than a place to teach people any specific kind of, I don't know, teaching, but rather create creative spaces to help open people up in different ways. But I love that a focus on attention. I was just thinking before we got on of one of my favorite lines of Mary Oliver, which is, I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention. And she goes on just talking about all the ways that she pays attention, how she falls down on her knees in the grass, that she knows how to be idle and blessed. But to me, life is always, without exception, alive and guiding us in this creative process. Always, without exception. And the more I walk down this path with the Wild Woman Project, the more that gets just stranger and stranger. And it's, I don't know, a sense of magic almost.
Something interesting about that line from Mary Oliver. It's like, I don't know what a prayer is. And some of that is because, we have an impoverished notion of prayer. Even the word, so our word prayer comes from the Latin precare, which means to beg. And so we have this idea that prayer are these petitions, and that can be prayer. That's not prayer, but that's not the only dimension of prayer. And what she demonstrated in the poem there is that, but I can pay attention, I can lay down in the grass. Prayer is also worship. It's praise. It's being appreciative, paying attention to the magic that is all around us. So prayer is worship. So she redefined the prayer by the poem.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know if I have these petitions to make, but I'm in love with the universe, and that's prayer.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Beautiful.
Yeah, prayerful way of living, to just truly see what's going on around you. Like, everyone's just very often in their own head or missing it. They're missing it. And that's why one of my other most major spiritual practices, which I didn't really pick up until about 5 years ago, but it's just like hiking in nature. There's something that happens after a few miles, it kind of dusts off sort of the fog of whatever is the thing that gets in the way of us seeing what's right in front of us. And suddenly trees look like they could open their trunks and speak to you.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Before we kind of come to a close, I did have another question and just curiosity around, you use the phrase architecture of circle in describing the sense of standing. I think you call it standing shoulder to shoulder. And it seems to indicate a kind of non-hierarchical structure that these gatherings are following, but it also seems to point to a shift away in terms of orientation from a very patriarchal, hierarchical, linear to a non-hierarchical and circular model of spiritual teaching and sharing. And I'm wondering just if you can speak to that architecture of circle and what you've noticed about enacting it and kind of how that connects to everything we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah. So just the shape, which is not foreign to Charis Foundation and the interspiritual dialogues, there's something really special that happens when you have everybody's heart facing toward the center point. It's a way different. If you just envision that, everybody's heart is facing towards a center point versus so often what we're used to is there's a person up on stage and the crowd is looking toward that person and there's like a single person shining back. That just is a completely different feel, and it brings completely different experience. So there's something very vulnerable actually about being in circle. Like there's nowhere to hide. You can't hide behind anything or anyone, I've had women show up to circle and like look at the small circle and be like, I don't know if I'm up for this, they eventually sit down and it's all great. But, there's something very vulnerable about that, and there's a sense that we consciously, and sometimes we speak to this and do a little practice around it, around like really taking off our masks and our armor. Like, the different, and not to characterize masks and armor in any kind of negative way. We need those things to survive sometimes, but that we set our masks down, that we consider the possibility of laying any armor, any barriers that we might have toward connecting, and try to allow ourselves to trust in this space. And because everyone's doing it together, including the facilitator, there's a sense, okay, well, I guess we're all going to be brave, eventually it'll be my turn to speak or express. And I'm more inclined to do that because everyone's doing it. Like everyone here is offering of themselves, of their hearts, offering, and that's a vulnerable thing to do, whether you're like getting really raw or not, So, and there's something of this thing that happens in that circular shape where you get so many more hits of like, oh yeah, you had that. I relate with that, like, oh, this is a person that's maybe 30 years my senior from a completely different culture and background. And oh my gosh, we've had this like core experience has been so meaningful to our hearts. And that kind of connection across difference that is able to happen in that circular shape where everyone is seeing and being seen is so powerful. And I think is increasingly a medicine for the time where we live, where, there's been all this attention brought to all the different differences that we have. Okay, yes, we have differences. How can we celebrate those differences and also find the places where we viscerally relate, And that's an important piece of the puzzle too. And this more kind of relational way of being, I think, can be very it would be really great to see that in more places, outside of circle, So you have this sense of whether you're in a family setting or whether you're at work, that sense of togetherness and that sense of belonging that occurs in that kind of shape, I think could be really helpful versus what we were used to. I'm raised by two Marines. So hierarchy is, that's that's probably in some ways, I think I'm just spending my whole life running in the other direction, But it's you're not getting orders from anyone. So then what happens in that space when everyone's allowed? It's a messier space, actually. But I don't mind messy. Look at the forest floor.
Yeah, it makes me curious just about your personal experience as a leader in those circles, in terms of if you can speak to the difference of how it feels for you, the difference between going and giving a talk in front of somebody, or maybe you're speaking to all these years of teaching yoga, even just being the yoga teacher that everyone's looking to and following to, and how that feels compared to facilitating a circle and still holding, it seems like, something of a leadership role and facilitating, but it seems different. I'm curious how it feels different to you.
Yeah. There's definitely one way to understand facilitating a circle as a form of hierarchy. And I'm not an idiot, I can see that. But there's a way to kind of, it's not fight it, but lean in a different direction a little bit. And I think the difference is the level of vulnerability and the level of weaving together. As a facilitator, you're constantly weaving together what's being shared, in a sense, right? You're finding places where what's shared over here relates with over here. You're constantly just essentially weaving this little web in the space between all of the people. And that's more probably jazz or something, it's versus something more planned out, so standing in front of an audience, which I do not care for that experience very much. I can do just a little bit of it, but I like better to, even if it's a big group, to somehow make a circle. We can make a circle somehow. There is a way. Because I think that thing that happens in people's brains when someone's essentially up on the pedestal, they're up on the stage, they're separate. I think that's a disempowering way to relate if we're trying to be in a spiritually attuned place together. So suddenly I'm to understand, if I'm in the audience and I'm looking at a single person on stage, okay, they have something to say. There's some kind of specialness happening with them that has allowed them to be there. Versus if that person were to step off the stage and we were to all be on the same level, it's just a totally different way of relating. And suddenly, as a participant, I'm looking at it and being oh, wow, they're right here. They're doing the same thing that I'm doing. They are not asking of me to do anything that they are not themselves doing.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think this connects to the dialogues too.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned that we meet in a circle too. And there are a couple aspects to that. One, one of the things we say in the dialogues, right, is we're not here to be teachers. All of those people happen to be leaders, or they don't just happen to be leaders. They are leaders, and it's part of why they're invited.
Right.
But then in the circle, we're not there to teach or lead one another. And we intentionally take off those roles so that we can be collegial, so we can be family. And so that's part of the circle structure, is to step out of that, even if that's a necessary mode in life, even if there have to be such roles. That's not what we're doing in a circle. And so that's one aspect of that. And the other aspect is that when we create the circle in a dialogue, it's not like the noble endeavor of interfaith dialogue, and I hope you heard my silly tone there. It's a ritual space. When you make a circle, you've made a ritual space. It's a place to cook something. And so thus, we're not surprised when something transformative happens in that space, because you've made a bounded space, which is a kind of crucible, and things get cooked there and transformed, transmuted, and it is messy. But, even though sometimes it's hard to hold, we don't go, oh, it went wrong. It was right, and therefore something got processed in it. Mm. And that can be heavy and hard, but it's because it's a true ritual space. A circle is a ritual space. And so, these two circle works, they connect because they're both circles, and there is a structure there that is a kind of magic circle. It does something. If you make it right.
That's right.
If it completes. That's
right. Yeah, it amplifies. It amplifies. Mm. To a degree that's, It feels actually magical. You're going, I've been in, I remember one of those dialogues I was in with you. It felt like the force of the divine feminine, and she was kind of pissed also. That was the experience I was getting, came into the circle, and it's like the face of the feminine came into the circle, and everyone felt it in a different way. It was extraordinary, but very messy, but ultimately extremely nourishing. But it amplified what was maybe already alive and going on the collective level. I think that was the dialogue that was not far before the Me Too movement. I feel like the Me Too movement emerged like within months after that. And exactly. That made perfect sense.
Yeah. That's what we felt too. Like it came right before the Me Too movement. And on reflection, reflecting on what we all experienced, it felt like it had room to arise. It had room to arise. It was allowed. And it had feelings. It had to be allowed to have those feelings. Yeah. And we talked about wonderful things in that dialogue. We talked about, Brenda was using the term, what is the sacred masculine? If we're trying to examine what the sacred feminine is and what it is in its liberated state, we also have to know this. And it was the dialogue where we learned that when you create the ritual space, something real happens. And so that was the one where we got that lesson, and it continued to happen through every dialogue in one form or another. And it's such a privilege. It's challenging, but it's such a privilege to know that you allowed something to be birthed or known or grow.
Yeah. So beautiful. It's why the dialogues are they sit in such a special place in my heart and my life. I'm always like a big yes. I'm always a big yes for that experience, because it truly is. It's like a person like me who has a bit of an anti-authority like bent, and it's hard for me. I'm not like other people who have like a teacher. They're like, I have a teacher, and this person, like, I sit with them and like I get an experience, like I'm not wired for it. I am not wired for it. but I am wired for the kind of experience that happens there, that's co-created and real and visceral. And because everyone's coming in with a pretty high level of spiritual practice attunement and skillfulness with others, so much can occur and it feels held and good and okay. Like that's the kind of spiritual adventure that I can get with. And I think, when I think about like the future of spirituality, like it's well known that a lot of the established religions are having like a really hard time right now. Like numbers are low. Interest is lower than it ever has been. And what is the future? But we all human beings have a spiritual thirst, a spiritual hunger. Like we need that part. So when I think about like what the future of spirituality looks like, it looks a lot more like circular, a lot more like dialogue space, a lot more like circles, women's circles, all kinds of circles. Because I think a lot of younger folks have a similar orientation for whatever reason. The collective consciousness is changing.
Yeah.
It's an interesting conversation with me and some of my colleagues because I teach religion, in a university. And some of my colleagues have said, oh, the younger students, they don't want religion anymore, and it's a kind of narrative. And I said, then I don't know why my classes are full. I teach a course called Religion and Mystical Experience. Like it's waitlisted every time. And my answer back to them was, it's not that they don't want religion and spirituality. It's that they feel excluded from the versions that currently exist.
Yeah.
And this is the problem we need to pay attention to. Why do they feel excluded? And do they have to be the way they've always been expressed?
Right.
Can they be expressed in different ways? And this is the work, because that impulse is primary, basic to us.
Oh, yeah.
So how's the need going to get met? Because it's there.
Yeah.
And that's not to say everybody has to have it and explore it the same way. But for, all those students, they may be anti-establishment, but they're curious and there's a great desire.
Absolutely.
How do we meet that?
My sense of it is in the experiential, like all of the traditions that want to survive will take their values, their teachings, their scripture, whatever it is, and create more, it's like more ritual, more place for the participants to have an actual experience of their own that's alive in them and in this moment, not just sort of going through the motions of what has been passed down to them.
Absolutely.
Definitely. Well, it feels like this is bringing us full circle, pun intended.
You've been waiting for that one.
Oh, waiting. But no, just before we do close out, I'm just curious if either of you have anything that's hanging. Nathaniel, if you have a hanging question. Chris, if you have anything that you would like to share with our listeners in terms of offerings that you're making and upcoming or anything like that, just before we close. And then if you would be willing to share with us this poem from Mary Oliver, that would be lovely to just have a little close.
Yeah, let's hear that.
Okay, great. Let me pull it up. I have the books on my couch spot that I was talking about earlier inside, but it's Summer's Day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who has flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?
Thank you, Chris.
Shout out to friend of the show, Treefort of Golden Turtle Sound, for producing the intro and outro music and assisting with mixing and mastering. Be sure to check out his awesome music and hit up Golden Turtle Sound for any of your audio engineering needs.